Welcome to the Tazara News Network, an African news network by Africans. Where there is no vision, the people perish. The video background shows the first university I ever went to. Today, this university is known as the University of Johannesburg. In those days, it was known as Rand Afrikaans Universiteit. It was a university that had been set up by the Dutch-speaking people of South Africa to educate their children because they realized that due to a lack of knowledge, they had let the wealth of South Africa slip through their fingers and into the hands of the English-speaking white people of South Africa. So these universities were specifically set up to give them a leg up. And I realized one thing when I was studying at this university. I realized that as Africans, we do not understand the modern financial system that was set up after World War II. When African countries became independent and we became part of the modern financial system, our leaders did not realize that the modern financial system is set up specifically to make the Western nations rich. This is why African countries fell into debt. This is why African countries owe a great deal of money to the Western financial systems. Africans have to realize, this is something that I realized during my first year at this university, that we do not have to borrow money from anyone, that the wealth of the world is in Africa, and that as long as we keep believing that we have to borrow from the IMF or the World Bank or anybody else out there, the wealth of Africa will slip from our fingers and into the hands of foreigners. Africa does not need to borrow, and in this video we're going to explain how Africa does not borrow, why Africa does not need to borrow, and how America was built without borrowing money from anyone. That the US government, to build the United States, did not borrow. They did what every Western country did. They printed the money to build their industries.
Richard D. Wolff.
Okay, this is one of those issues around which a level of, I'll use a technical term, bullshit. There's a level of bullshit around this topic that it makes even the other topics of economics, which suffer from the same problem, look like nothing in comparison. So let's go through it. It has always been true that if you have a monetary system in which the basic money is produced by the government, as for example, in most modern capitalist societies, like the United States or Canada or Europe, the government produces the money. The euro notes you have in your wallet are printed by the government, the European government. The dollars in my wallet are printed by the United States and so on. So obviously, the easiest way to control the money system, if you want more money, print more. And if you want less money, burn what you printed last year. This is not complicated. So if the job of the government is to manage things by using the money system, this is childishly easy. But the problem has always been that what is childishly easy becomes a temptation for those in power to use it not to manage the economy, but to get themselves out of political difficulty when they have one. And the best example is a government wants to go to war. Okay, how is it going to pay for the war? And the answer could be, well, you could say to your people, a war is something that affects all of us, so all of us must be okay with having a war, otherwise we shouldn't have it. And the way to make that real is to say we're going to pay for the war by taxing you. The way we pay for the roads and the way we pay for the schools, we're going to pay for the war. The problem is, if a government wants to have a war, the fastest way to have your people turn against you is to make them pay for the war. So what all governments have done throughout history is to use the power of creating money to pay for the war. So basically what the government does is it prints more money in order to pay for the war. Simple. The problem here is if you let the government print money, it's possible that all that money will be going into the hands of businesses and people who are going to be nervous that with all of this money being pumped into the economy, it may become the case that money loses its value. Or to say the same thing in other ways, all that money will chase goods and services, and with all the money, the prices will be bid up. It's as if, think of it this way, if I came into your village and suddenly I distributed money to everybody, you would all then run to the local store and want to get, I don't know, a shirt or an ice cream cone or whatever. But with everybody having more money, if there wasn't enough shirts and ice cream cones, each of you would offer the storekeeper a little extra because you have a lot of money, and so the prices would go up. Or to say the same thing in economic language, if you print a lot of money, you have the risk of an inflation, of a rise in prices, and that can disturb how an economy functions. Because governments did this, because they produce horrible inflations over and over again, because of the corrupt use of government money printing capability, the decision was made to not let governments do that, to put a limit on them. And the limit that was found in a capitalist society was to say, if you're going to spend more money than you raise in taxes, you're going to have a public debt that we can all understand and that we can make sure doesn't get too big so you can't quite do what you want to do freely. So we make governments run a budget deficit. That's all it is. It's a difference between what they spend and what they earn in taxes. And we don't let them print the money in a difference. We make them go through a silly procedure. They issue bonds to pay for the deficit. That is, they borrow the money so that they can spend more than they raise in taxes. Okay, they issue the bonds. But that doesn't get them the money. It just gets them the bond. They can print the bond. They can't print the money. So we require them to take the bond and sell it to some investor. Somebody has to give them the money for the bond. Someone has to lend them the money. And then the private bankers, that's who mostly does it, who lend the government the money for the deficit, are then allowed to take that bond that they've gotten from the government and go to another office of the same government and sell the bond for new money, for newly printed money. For example, in this country, the Federal Reserve plays that role. In European countries, it's usually the central bank, the Bank of France, the Bank of England, whatever it is. And so we make the system go through these bizarre steps. In the end, it's the same thing. One part of the government prints the money that they then use to buy the bonds that another part of the government printed. But we hope that by giving the banks and the other investors this crucial role in the middle, it'll hold back the government from wildly overprinting the money. It, of course, doesn't work because, yes, you have to go through 3 or 4 steps, but a government that wants to do it doesn't. So, for example, in the aftermath of the 2008 crash, all governments in the world, led by the United States, have printed mountains of new money and pumped them in as if they were an old king who did it 400 years ago. So we are now faced with a dilemma. We have big deficits being run, not just in Japan, but in Europe, in the United States, all over. And we are monetizing it by printing the money through the central bank. So we are now worried, all of us in the United States, because on the one hand, we need to keep doing this because the economy has not recovered from the crash of 2008. But we are worried because we have added so much money into the economy that the risk of an inflation exploding onto the world economy is very
My
real.
beloved Africa, the Western world has no real wealth. They went broke more than 70 years ago. China is not the largest holder of US government bonds. It is the US government itself. When the US government needs money to build roads, to build schools, to fund their military, they print it. That's what every industrialized nation does, from Britain, from France, to Italy, to Japan, to China. All the projects that the Chinese government is doing in Africa, all the loans that they're giving to the African governments to build roads, to build all these kind of things. I give credit to the African governments for finally starting to produce the infrastructure we need. But those loans have to be paid back. When in fact, what the Chinese government does is that they print money, then they lend that money to the African governments at interest, when the African government should be printing their own money to finance their own projects. If they want to hire Chinese construction companies to do the work, that's fine. But you can't be printing money. You can't be borrowing printed money to pay at interest. This is how the African people are being robbed of their resources. And everyone knows that all the people, the group of people in this world who do not understand how the economic system works are Africans. Everyone knows how the game is played, apart from us. No one in this world, no one borrows printed money. Everyone prints their own money and funds their own projects. That's the way it's been done since World War II. The British were the first to start doing it. They started printing their own money in the 1930s. That's why the Western world abandoned the gold standard, so that they could print their money, so that they could print money in large quantities to fund whatever projects they needed to do. And they have taught the Africans that the Africans should not print money, but they should borrow from the West. No one does this apart from Africans, and everyone knows that. Everyone knows that you can take colored pieces of paper and give it to the Africans in exchange for their resources. And it's not just the West anymore. It's not just the Chinese. Other people are coming to Africa. The Turks, the Arabs from the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and all those other places, they're all coming to Africa because they're all coming and telling the African governments, oh, here are colored pieces of paper. Now give us your resources. And the people of Africa have to wake up and realize that it's insane to give up your resources for colored pieces of paper when you can do it yourself. This is one of the biggest mistakes that the African governments have made. And the people of Africa and the governments of Africa have to realize that this is a critical mistake. The moment the governments of Africa, whose performance has improved, start printing their own money, start financing their own projects, is the time Africa will be able to move quickly and become as developed as anywhere else.